Today I wanted to come back to sort of a beginning spot for where New Thought, or sometimes it's called the American Metaphysical Movement, metaphysics, things like that, where it really got its start in this country, which was in physical healings. And there's kind of a pattern of conditions, if we'll call them conditions. I think Buddhism calls it conditioned mind. But there's a pattern of conditions that people typically come when they come to a practitioner or to a minister for spiritual work. And usually it revolves around health, physical health in the body. It revolves around wealth, which is the flow of supply through our lives. It revolves around love, loving relationships, sometimes romantic relationships, relationships with a significant other, spouse, family, sometimes a work relationship, relationships with co-workers, peers, bosses, subordinates, those kind of things. Many times it has to do with creative self-expression. People do not feel fulfilled in the activities of their lives, particularly their job. You know, we go to work for at least 40 hours a week. And if it doesn't fulfill us, it eats away at us, literally. And then spiritual attunement, which is probably the most important, but usually the last thing that people come about, is how do I grow more spiritually? How do I do this thing that we keep talking about? How do I come into the experience of the presence and the activity of God in my life? What do I need to do? What do I need to read? What practices, what techniques, all those sorts of things. So we come back from time to time, we come back and speak on these topics individually. And today we're going to make our approach through health and healing. But I invite you to keep in mind that the things that we're talking about go way beyond. They go way beyond health and healing. They affect all of these other areas of our lives. So the example I use is many years ago, I worked in a computer room. Some of them are still around. Some of the government complexes still have them. The computer room that had a raised floor. You may have seen them in some movies. But the old computer rooms, the floors were raised about 3 feet off of the level of the rest of the building. You would actually go up a couple steps to get into the computer room. And that was because all the cables ran underneath the floor. So all the equipment was up, suspended 3 feet off of the concrete floor below, and the cables crisscrossed underneath the floor. And the floor tiles were much like the ceiling tiles that are in the grid overhead. The floor tiles just laid in a framework. And if we had to get under the floor, which we had to do from time to time, if we were trying to run a trouble that we thought might be in the cable, or if we were adding a new piece of equipment and we had to run a new cable, we had to lift that floor up. Or you couldn't just grab onto the tile. The tile was laying in a rack. The floor tile was a big panel, you know, maybe 2 feet by 2 feet or 3 feet by 3 feet. So what we had a handle with 2 suction cups on it, a suction cup on each end. Sometimes you see the glass people carrying a big piece of plate glass through the streets, and they've got a handle that attaches to the glass. It's the same idea. And we would put those suction cups down, and there's a little lever that you would flip that would tighten them down, make the suction, and then you could lift out the panel from the floor. So the reason I bring that up is this thing called God, this thing called the divine, this thing called spirit, this thing called love, whatever name we have for it. Remember, as I said a couple weeks ago, it's not the name, it's beyond the name. The name is just kind of an entry point that we use, a place to start to try to get back to what is this thing. And this is why the first chapter of the textbook is called The Thing Itself. If Dr. Holmes had named it, everybody would say, oh, I know exactly what that means. And what they would be referring to is their definition of what that term is. So he uses an ambiguous term, the thing itself, and that causes us to think it causes us to examine. We have to be reflective in our thinking. We have to ask ourselves, how do I know what I know? What do I know? Do I really know it, or am I just repeating somebody else's opinion, what somebody else told me? You know, as children in school, my experience many times was simply that what we were supposed to do was remember what the teacher told us long enough to take a test. It wasn't necessarily about developing thinking skills or challenging the opinions of the textbook to see what other opinions might exist. It was just simply, this is what the book says, remember these answers long enough to take the test, and then you can go on to the next year. And as we grew up, if we grew up in any type of a structured or organized religion, perhaps our religious training was the same way. You know, we had a catechism, and we were told, you know, what the answers in the catechism were, and we learned how to repeat those. And if we could answer the questions when they were asked of us, well, then we could move on. We could move on and receive communion, or receive confirmation, or advance through the hierarchy of spiritual growth in that particular system that I grew up in, and many people share a similar experience. But we really have to stop and realize now that all of those concepts, all of those ideas, all of those images of what it is, this it being God or divine or spirit or love or nature, whatever you choose to call it, this I love what Joseph Campbell's definition. He said, God, the word God, is a metaphor for that which transcends every limitation of human consciousness. That's about as good a definition as I think there is. So what is your name for that which transcends every limitation of human consciousness? What is it, your name for that which is without beginning, without end, without any limits, all powerful, all knowing, all presence? Whatever your name for that is the handle, that is your handle that you have used to try to get a hold of that which is in itself ineffable, beyond understanding, beyond words. The human mind cannot conceive, cannot understand without beginning, without end. Our entire life experience tells us that everything and everyone has a beginning and has an end. We call the beginning birth, we call the beginning death. You buy a new car and you drive it for 10 or 20 years, and then it goes to the junkyard, and it's cut up into pieces and melted down, and then it makes another new car. Everything in the human experience has a beginning and an end, and yet this ineffable one, some of the Hindu prayers say, oh, ineffable one, beyond our ability to understand by words, beyond our ability to understand by intellect, oh, ineffable one. Has no beginning, has no end. So this handle that I described, that we use to get a grip on things that we can't otherwise get a grip on, I invite you to consider that the name that we use for the ineffable one is one such handle. And then these conditions in our lives, excuse me, these experiences in our lives that I described as being health, wealth, love, creative self-expression, spiritual attunement, those are also handles, those are also entry points. So we may come to a realization that we are not experiencing physical health or mental health or emotional health, right? We're not experiencing to the degree that we believe we ought to this thing called health. And then that is what kind of serves as a doorway or a gateway or an entryway into a deeper spiritual realization, which we would call healing. Now, just a little bit of history. So many years ago, in the 1800s in this country, the best educated person in town was typically the priest. Remember, when the Europeans came to this country, the English came and they brought their priests with them, the Episcopal priests. The coast, up and down the coast, if you go there, the Episcopal Church was the American Anglican Church. So if you go up and down the coast, there are many, many Episcopal churches. As later settlers came and they brought different religions with them, you can see where they went. Where I live here in Rock Hill, South Carolina, we are literally on the Great Wagon Trail. And when in the 1750s, when the Ulster Scots came to this country, the land in Pennsylvania was too expensive for them to settle. And they pushed down the Great Wagon Trail, which, if you look at a map, kind of follow Interstate 81 down to Roanoke from Pennsylvania. Start in Philadelphia, take the Pennsylvania Turnpike over to Harrisburg, and then come down 81 about to Roanoke, and then come down 77 all the way to through Columbia, and then go over to Augusta. That was called the Great Warrior Path of the Great Wagon Road. It was a Native American series of trading trails that later became roads that the settlers used, and now our interstate highways follow them. But the point I'm making is that you can see that new towns sprung up every couple years, about a day's travel further and further down that path. And those people, the Ulster Scots, were Presbyterian. And we have more Presbyterian churches here than you'll find Anglican or Episcopal churches. The Episcopal churches are down in Charleston. That was the old part of the state. So people would come and they would bring their concept, they would bring that handle, they would bring their ideas and their images of God with them. But in the early 1800s, the best educated person in town was typically the priest, the clergyman, who was also the doctor. And what this meant was that if people went to the doctor, they were getting their religion and their medicine in the same place. And if the medicine wasn't working, they would seek alternatives. There's an interesting book, I think it's called Alternative Medicine and the American Religious Experience, I believe is the title. You can look on it on the internet. And it talks about how when people were not experiencing the degree of health that they thought they should, that they would seek out an alternative from their priest, from their religion. And this brought people into communication with other ways of thinking, with other handles, okay, with other ways of looking at the same thing, the same ineffable thing. So such is the idea that I want to start with, which is P.P. Quimby in Belfast, Maine. He was a clockmaker and a cabinet maker. And he's typically considered to be ground zero for the metaphysical movement in the United States. And he went to a lecture on, I think they call it animal magnetism or mesmerism in those days. Remember Emile Coué, every day in every way I'm getting better and better. He was from Switzerland. One of Coué's associates was in the United States giving a lecture series on mesmerism or animal magnetism. Later we would call it hypnotism, but not exactly the same thing. Very similar, but not exactly the same thing. And Quimby went to it and he became very fascinated. He apparently experimented with it, had some kind of a healing of a physical condition in his own life. And he began experimenting with it. And he had this young man, Lucas or Lucretius, I can't remember the name, I should have looked it up earlier, who was an extremely good subject. Quimby could work with this young man and put him into a deep trance state. And what they discovered was that if people would come to Quimby and say, oh, you know, my grandfather in Ohio is not feeling well, can you do something? He would put this young man into a deep trance-like state and say, go visit Grandpa in Ohio and find out what he says is wrong with him, and then tell him that there's nothing wrong with him. And this is what he would do. He would use the consciousness of this young man in a trance-like state, and through mental means, not spiritual, mental means, there were healings. If you've read any of Edgar Cayce's work, Edgar Cayce from Virginia Beach, Newport News, Virginia, he too would go into a deep trance-like state, and he would receive information, and he would go visit people and things like that. So this was a similar idea to what Quimby was doing. And Quimby later came to realize that he didn't need Lucretius, he didn't need hypnotism, he didn't need the trance-like state. What was happening is that when people's beliefs changed, by whatever means their beliefs came to be changed, their physical condition changed. That is kind of the start of the American metaphysical movement here in the United States. And from that, Mary Baker Eddy went to see Quimby, and I have to tell you, there's like two different versions of this history here as to whether she helped Quimby more than Quimby helped her, but nevertheless they were together for a while. And the story, one of the stories is that she went to Quimby, she experienced a physical healing, and she wanted to learn more about it, and she decided that she had rediscovered the healing method that Jesus used, and she called it Christian Science and founded the Christian Science Church, and people would go there and have healings. Emma Curtis Hopkins came to study with Mary Baker Eddy. Emma Curtis Hopkins later went out and founded the Chicago Seminary, or the Illinois Seminary, and she became known as teacher of teachers and taught thousands of people. And you can find in the United States that the Fillmores of Unity, the Brooks Sisters of Divine Science, Ernest Holmes of Religious Science, many different New Thought teachers, including one whose book I've been reading this week. His name is H.B. Jeffrey. I can't reach the book right now. H.B. Jeffrey, who wrote The Principles of Healing, which we use in practitioner training class. And Jeffrey was a Christian preacher, and he writes in very Christian terms. The point here is that when people see tangible results, they were sick and now they're no longer sick. When they see tangible results, they know that something is going on. Dr. Holmes told us you can't argue with results. You can't argue with results. So oftentimes people will come into a new teaching because they had a healing of sorts, of whatever it is. And I want to be very clear about this, because sometimes people think, oh, well, it's all psychosomatic, without going into deep detail about what they mean by psychosomatic. See, we do this in our culture. We try to put a label on something, and once we put a label on it, we pretend like we know exactly what it means. And one of the easiest ways to break down is ask why 5 times. Why does psychosomatic healing work? Dr. Herbert Benson, you may remember Benson up in Harvard. He has the Mind Body Institute up there, or had it. I don't know if he's still with us. But he wrote many years ago the book, The Relaxation Response, and then he went on to try to explore what he called remembering wellness. He said the placebo effect should not be called the placebo effect. It should be called remembering wellness, because there's something within us that already knows how to be well, and we just have to remember it. And that's what the placebo effect is. So people will look at something and say, well, that's nothing more than a placebo effect. And maybe it is, but maybe we're saying exactly the same thing. What is the placebo effect? So Benson said that we really need to have people research the placebo effect as earnestly as they research a new drug. And maybe they would find out how to be more effective and more efficient at invoking what he calls this remembering wellness response, to let the healing take place from within as opposed from without. So no matter how we come to it, then there's this idea that somehow these non-material means, whether it be through prayer, through spiritual mind treatment, through Quimby sending Lucretius off to go visit sick people, and Edgar Cayce going off to be with a sick person and make a diagnosis about what would heal them. All these different things, there is something there, see. And it's not just that people imagined they were sick and now they imagine that they are better. They were really sick. They were physically ill and now they are physically well. And Dr. Holmes tells us not to delude ourselves. He said, if you are treating for blood pressure, if you're treating yourself or someone else who has high blood pressure, you don't stop until the doctor puts the cuff on them and says the blood pressure is now normal. You don't turn your head away from the appearances and say, oh, well, even though the sphygmometer says my blood pressure is 240 over 160, I know it's perfect, whole, and complete, so I'm not going to do anything about it. Holmes says we don't do that. What we do is we continue to do our treatment until the demonstration is made. And we do our treatment work as long as it takes until the demonstration is made. So we start then with this assertion that there is and there are and there continue to be instances of where things that appear to be purely physical things are healed through non-physical things, through prayer, through spiritual mind treatment, through a change in belief, through remembering wellness, through whatever we want to call it. And when people have that experience, they have that experience of something happened here. What just happened here? How did that happen? That is their handle. That is their entryway. Then that is their quest to drive in and try to understand then more about who am I? Why am I here? How did this happen? If I am just nothing more than a couple of dollars worth of chemicals in a sack of skin and bones, how did that happen? And that leads them on the quest. But where they get when they follow that quest is they get to the same place that they would get if they had entered through the condition of, I'm not experiencing an adequate flow of supply through my life, or I'm not experiencing an adequate expression of love in my life, or I'm not experiencing an adequate self-expression that is fulfilling in the work that I do, or I'm not satisfied with my spiritual progress. How do I grow? All of those roads are kind of like different paths that lead up the same mountain. They lead to the top of the mountain. We used to show the 1946 version of the movie The Razor's Edge with Tyrone Power and Gene Tierney. And there's a scene where Tyrone Power's character, Larry Darrell, who's on a spiritual quest, goes to study with this guru up in the Himalayas, and he's about to go up to the top of this mountain and sit in a cave, and he's going to just read these very spiritual books. And the guru says to him, he says, there's three major paths to God. There's the path of love, there's the path of knowledge, which you have chosen, and then there's the path of service. But when you follow any of the three paths, you eventually come to realize they were all the same path. See? And what that is saying is we each have to find something that appeals to us, that's going to hold our interest, and we have to follow that path until we get back to where it leads us. And when we get back to where it leads us, we find that all of the paths led there. All of these different ways led there. So that's just a little bit of the history of New Thought in this country, that it started with something real and something tangible and something that people weren't getting through their through their established clergy. And that's not saying that there's anything wrong with the Episcopal Church. It's saying they weren't, whatever way they were connecting with it, they weren't connecting in a manner that demonstrated itself through healing. So we start with the assertion then that there is this phenomenon, there is this event. It is called spiritual healing. And we want to know then, well, what is it? Well, how could it possibly work? What can be healed? How often should I do whatever technique I am using for healing? So the first thing, I want to start right at the very beginning. At the very beginning, we have to start by asking ourselves, do I really believe? Do I really believe that it is possible And it does in fact happen that physical conditions change under the influence of consciousness. Whether that influence be through a prayer, through a meditation, through a sudden enlightenment, through an epiphany that we have. Do we really believe that? Because if we don't believe that, then that's where we got to start. You can try to do the other things, but if you don't believe it, that's where you have to go. Is there or isn't there? That's what some inquiring minds want to know. So I'm going to give you a couple of resources. If that's where you are in your path, if you're looking at that and saying, well, it's kind of nice to believe that if I say a prayer somehow I'm going to be healed, but I'm not certain that I understand it. Not certain that I believe it. So one place I would suggest you to go is read Dr. Dean Radin's book called The Conscious Universe. And in that book he gives great, long and boring statistical analysis of different phenomena that yield, physical phenomena that yield to consciousness. Random number generators, for example, that go askew when a group of people get together and try to concentrate on changing the output of those things. Many different experiments, and one of which I was sharing with somebody during the week is the effectiveness of prayer in healing. And he's, according to what I read in his book, he says that prayer is 5 times more effective in people with cardiac events than giving them a daily regimen of a low-dose aspirin. And yet doctors prescribe all the time the 81 milligram aspirin, but they're not able to, the culture will not let them say, hey, you really need to learn how to pray, or you need to go to church, right? That would be something they can't do according to the way that they're taught. But Radin's whole point in writing the book is the proof is there. The proof is there. Herbert Benson's book that I recommended, he's got several. You might just want to look up, I think Remembering Wellness. If you Google Herbert Benson and Remembering Wellness, you'll start to find examples. Look at the Shrine of Lourdes in France, where they keep meticulous records of people who go there and then claim that they have had a miraculous healing. And they have doctors who review the case and then determine whether or not there is a medical explanation for why this person suddenly got well. One case I remember was in a TV show, and this young man was from Italy, and he was an Italian soldier, and he developed, I had never heard of this, but he developed tuberculosis in his bones, in his hips, or a hip. And they had an X-ray. They had an X-ray of the hip, and on the X-ray you couldn't tell, like when you normally look at a skeleton, you can see where it is. This was more like a blob of jelly that showed up on the X-ray. And they told this man that there was nothing they could do for him. He was going to die. And they discharged him from the service, and they sent him home. And he had always wanted to visit Lourdes, and he said he was not a particularly religious man. He wasn't going there expecting a miracle or a healing. He wasn't going there to pray. He was just simply going there because he wanted to see what it was all about. And he did, and he went there, and he visited with all of these other tourists and pilgrims from all around the world who go to this place in hopes of a healing. And he went back home, and 6 months came and 6 months went, and he didn't die. And finally he went back to the doctors and said, I'm still here, what's going on? And they showed the after X-ray. They took another X-ray, and the skeleton was back, the bones were back, the whatever had been there was completely gone. So this is documented, in the records at Lourdes. Now, it's an example of there was a physical condition. You could see it on the X-ray, and that physical condition is gone. That's that. It was there, and it is now. It is not there. Did it have anything to do with him visiting Lourdes? That's where the conjecture would come in. Oh, well, it could have gone away anyway. Maybe it could have. Maybe it did. But the point is, It was not a material action. Something else was taking place. So I invite you, if you're kind of on the fence saying, well, I don't know, maybe not, that's where your work begins. That's where your work begins. You have to keep working at your own consciousness until you can decide for yourself whether or not you believe that this thing that we call matter is influenced by consciousness, is influenced by consciousness. Quantum physics, I would suggest that you look for on the internet, you look for some lectures by Dr. Henry Stapp, S-T-A-P-P, on the mind-body connection. There's about an hour-long videotape of Dr. Stapp at a United Nations conference on mind-body. And he's talking about, you know, and quantum physics, and there's all these possibilities, and then they collapse into one specific. And, you know, perhaps our consciousness is what collapses the quantum wave into the specifics of our body and things like that. Interesting things to look at, interesting things to think about. He talks about the double slit experiment with light, and light, is light a wave, or is light a particle, or is light both, or is light neither? And does light start as one and change to another depending on whether or not somebody's observing it? And all these kind of things that I'm sure they go much deeper than I'm capable of going. But these are the kind of things that you want to start digging into. These are the kind of place that you want to start if you are not yet convinced that a change in consciousness can produce a change in physical conditions in my life. So for many of us, it starts with anecdotal evidence. For many of us, it starts with reading about other people, like the soldier, you know, who went to Lourdes and suddenly had this healing, you know. Other spontaneous remissions, other times that people who were supposed to die didn't die, or people whose bodies were riddled with you know, terminal diseases that suddenly disappeared, and things like this. And our experience or exposure to that is anecdotal, right? We read the stories, and you have to be careful. I'm advising everybody, be reflective. You have to be careful. Everything you read is not necessarily true. So you want to be reflective, and you want to go in there and say, is there another explanation? Did something else happen here? But I think if you earnestly go in and start digging, and you start looking at these things, you start to see there's something else going on here. There's something else going on here. And all we need to know is that there's something else going on here. That's all we need to know as a starting place, as a handle to go in here. So we're looking then at this thing that we call physical healing, and the consciousness that heals, and healing through spiritual means. And we say, well, what is that? How could that possibly work? Why could it possibly work? And could I possibly work it? Could I possibly make it work in my life? See, so this is what happens. We have the anecdotal experience, and then we experiment with it in our lives. We begin to find a technique to use in our lives. You know, very simple premise. It's done unto you according to your belief. Well, how do I change my belief? If it's done unto me according to my belief, I should be able to somehow change my belief about something. Maybe I'll start with something easy to change my belief about, and I'll see for myself if the conditions in my life change. Read the self-help psychology books. Read all of the motivational books that are out there, and all of them get down to the fact that if you change your attitude, you change your thinking, your experience changes. Try it. Try to find a way to change your consciousness. Try to find a way to change what you believe, and see if something doesn't change, you know. We get up in the morning, am I going to have a good day or a bad day? Well, I don't know, you know, I have to see what's out there. Well, no, what are your expectations? Remember I talked to you last week about intention. What are your intentions? What are your intentions? So we're going to come now to the healing aspect. to this idea of spiritual healing. And we have to say to ourselves, well, how does this thing work? What are the theories? And realize theories can be updated as we go along, but what are the theories? What's the idea behind this? So maybe I've done my homework, maybe I've read my books, maybe I've paid attention to Benson, I've read Dean Radin, I've listened to Henry Stapp, I've done all these things, and now you've got me going, yeah, there's something there, there's something more. We are more than what takes place just inside this bag of bones. Why should this thing called physical healing by spiritual means work? And here we have to take a step back from many of our traditional religions. Here we have to stop and think that there's only one life. There's only one life, and that life is God. And we start our treatment with that, or I do anyway. There's only one life. Now, I often use the example of the child's toy, the Light Bright, which many of us had for our kids. They probably don't have any more because their choking hazard, and rightfully so. But you know, it was a little plastic box that was open on the top, but the top was on a slant. You know, the whole thing was kind of slanted towards you, and it had a piece of plastic that went over the top that had holes in it, like the pegboard we used to hang in our garages. And then you would take a piece of construction paper, black construction paper, and you would put it over those holes. And on that piece of construction paper there were little dots, each of a different color, and they all together, they made a drawing, a rabbit or a house or something like that. And what the child would do is just take these little plastic pegs, these little clear plastic pegs, and put the peg through the associated dot, the same color dot on the paper. So the red dots where you put red pegs, or the white dots where you put white pegs. And when the child got done, they had created this drawing in light of whatever the outline on the construction paper was. Now, there's only one light. There was only one light. See, each of these pegs, they had no light of their own. Each of these pegs was only an instrument through which the one light in the Light Bright shone through. So each individual peg was expressing in a unique way, limited to what color they were, but in a unique way, each peg was expressing that one light in a different way. If we can keep that model in mind, and we want to go back and think, then, well, there's only one. There's only one. There's only God. There's only God as us. There's not God and us. There's not God and anything. There's only God. God is all, in all, as all. God. That is our starting place then for the spiritual healing. Divine love has created us out of itself. Divine love is expressing its life through us, and the divine love is perfect. It is absolutely perfect. There's something in Scripture that says nothing defiled can enter into the presence of God, which led to the idea of purgatory, right? So being that sometimes souls had to go to purgatory until they worked off their sins before they went to heaven, to the presence of God, because nothing defiled could enter the presence of God. There's another way of looking at it. Right? The divine mind cannot see. The divine mind cannot see anything that is unlike itself. It doesn't exist in the divine mind. So imagine yourself on the surface of the sun, and you're looking back towards Earth. You can't see the dark side of the sun. It's not there. You can't see it. The light cannot see the darkness. Right? A beam of a flashlight can pass through miles and miles and miles of night. The beam of the lighthouse, you know, down on the coast, North Carolina, the beams of those lighthouses go out to sea 18 or 19 miles, because that's how far the ships needed to stay offshore in order to avoid the shoals out there. So from a ship that far out, the light looked like it was right on the horizon. For you and I standing at the foot of it, we look up, it's, a couple hundred feet in the air. But that light goes through 18 or 19 miles of darkness, and it doesn't know the darkness. So nothing defiled exists in the consciousness of the divine mind, and that consciousness is our consciousness, your consciousness and my consciousness. But we don't fully experience it. We don't fully experience it because the human race consciousness, has for thousands, if not millions of years, judged by appearances, judged by the appearances. We believe in the reality of matter over mind. Right? There's one question that I tell everybody to consider. There's just one question that you ever have to really answer. Did matter create consciousness? Or did consciousness create matter? That's all. Stay with that one question until you've resolved it. And that will resolve this whole issue of spiritual identity for you. And so the creation myths of the world tell us that consciousness created matter. In the beginning was the void, and the voice of God moved upon the waters, the breath of God moved upon the waters, and said, let there be planets, and there were planets. Right? The mythology, the teaching story is telling us that matter comes into being moved by an act of consciousness. The other way that we will hear it is that somehow the matter of the earth formed itself into an organism, and somehow that organism developed a brain, and somehow that brain developed consciousness, which is saying then that matter created consciousness. And we have to go to that idea. We have to stay with that idea. We have to roll that idea around in our mind until we've satisfied ourselves one way or the other what we believe. So we have in our individual consciousness, we have a collection of ideas that are race consciousness. Carl Jung might call the collective unconscious. We have a collection of ideas that are based on the way things appear, but not based on the way things are in reality. In biblical terms, we are looking through a glass darkly. We don't see things as they are, we see things as we are. We don't see things as they are, we see things as we expect them to be. And we have this layer upon layer upon layer of false ideas. And it's important to keep that in mind. We have layer upon layer upon layer of false ideas about what life is, the way life works, what is disease, what is health. We have all of these different ideas, and you don't have to go far to get exposed to them, all of these different ideas. When we believe in the reality of those false ideas, we have the experience that goes with them. It is done unto you according to your belief. Flip back over to the image I just gave you of standing on the surface of the sun and looking back towards earth, and all of the ideas about what's not true might be the dark side of the earth, the side that has its back turned away from the light. The instant the earth rotates just a little bit more, that which was in darkness comes into the light, comes into the light. The light is not affected by the darkness. The light doesn't have to fight with the darkness. The light doesn't have to struggle with the darkness. The darkness is a condition. It is conditioned mind, if we want to go back to the Buddhist terms, conditioned mind. Our minds have been conditioned to believe a certain way. The instant that the light enters that conditioned area, previously conditioned, the darkness is gone. The darkness disappears. It is dispelled. So we're going to bring this to a point where we can break off until next week and pick it up to conclude. But what we want to consider so far is that the experiences that we have in what appears to be a purely physical life are more than just that. They are more than just that. And you can find the evidence for that if you will seek it. If you're kind of scientifically motivated, Henry Stapp is good, Herbert Benson is good. Another one that's good is Frederick Bales, and Your Mind Can Heal You. The physical experiences we have are influenced by our thoughts, our beliefs, and our emotions. I'll leave you with this one example of someone who walks down to the side of the river and puts their foot down in the side of the river barefoot, and they step on a big snake, and their heart races and their blood pressure goes up, and they run as quickly as they can. They get the fight or flight response that Benson talks about. They had a physiological change in their bodies, a measurable physical experience in their bodies as a result of stepping on that snake. But now they go back down to the river to look at the snake, and they find out it wasn't a snake at all. It was simply an old piece of rope that somebody had discarded that washed up on the shore, the bank of the river. There was no snake. But their body responded as if there were a snake. Their body responded to their thought. Their body responded to their thought. So one thing to do, if you want to do it during the week, is look at some of the resources I suggested. Raise the question in your mind and be a critical thinker. And by that I mean ask yourself, how do I really know what I know? Am I just reading something I would like to believe, and therefore I'm going to call it true? No. Read, and ask yourself, how do I know? And try to bring yourself to a realization of the fact that which we call our physical experience is a result of our thoughts. That's the first thing to do. The second thing that I invite you to do this week is I want you to take a few minutes when you do your spiritual practice. I want you to take a few minutes of nothingness, of stillness. Don't try to talk to God. Don't try to listen to God. Don't try to not listen to God. But just be still and know. Just be still and know. Breathe in, breathe out. Count from 1 to 5. Do whatever works for you. But just be still. Just be still. And before you do that, say to yourself, there's an intelligence and a presence within me that is expressing its life as me, that knows perfectly well what to do this day. Every cell, every organ, every tissue of this body is expressing that perfection. And then just be still. Just be still. So next week when we come back, we're going to pick up from here. This is a big topic, but it is a most important topic. We're going to talk some more about the fact that there's only this one life, and the problems that we face come from the false belief in separation. And a false belief is nothing anyway. It's not even real. And we're going to talk about what can be healed. What is the technique of healing, and how often should we practice the technique? So if you or someone you know is having, a challenge, a physical challenge, This is a good time to try, with their permission. This is a good time to try, bringing yourself, not them, bringing yourself to a different place in consciousness, so that the healing power that is already there, the perfection is already there, can come through. So we'll pick it back up next week.